Kia ora and welcome to the launch of the TIN Agritech Insights Report. Today I'm delighted to be joined by TIN founder Greg Shanahan and TIN Operations Manager Brendan Bohan. Welcome, gentlemen. For some context, the technology investment network TIN is the leading independent source of information on New Zealand's technology sector. Founded in 1999, TIN has been taking the pulse of New Zealand's technology exporters for nearly 20 years. It has a simple message, a mission even, to help facilitate the growth of the technology sector in New Zealand. TIN seeks to achieve this goal through a range of endeavours, from the creation of networking events and resources for the high-tech sector, including the TIN 100 report, through to hands-on business management and custom research endeavours. I cannot think of a more appropriate location for the launch of the TIN report than the studio at Fieldays TV. So welcome, gentlemen. And it's been a long time coming, Greg. I think, as I said, established in 1999. This is the first time there's been a dedicated insights report on Agritech. And I think the thing that I'm waiting for, and I think the audience are waiting for, are, can you summarise its key findings?
Kia ora, Peter. Yes, I just have to explain I was 10 when TIN was started, so still quite young and have the energy to still do this stuff. The key findings of the report, and bullet point wise, the companies, the largest 20 or so companies, Agritech companies, turn over about 1.4 billion. They're employing around about 5,000 staff, primarily Kiwis. Staff numbers grew by over 300 jobs just last year. And in terms of exports, about 800 million. And so outside of Australasia, the largest market is North America.
Interesting. Brendan, I know not every Agritech company in the country might be in the report. So can you just explain how TIN evaluates companies and how they are included, or why they're included in the report?
Yeah, absolutely. TIN is all about the new IP, the companies which are developing the new technology. So the criteria that we look for companies that are included, they need to originate in New Zealand, have a meaningful presence in New Zealand. They operate in either high-tech manufacturing or biotech or ICT spaces. That's the three primary sectors that we look at. And then they need to be developing their own IP as part of that. So that's a pretty tight kind of definition that we have for all the companies that feature in there. So in this report, which is being released today, we're totally taking a look at the 20 companies that fit that criteria from the TIN 200. And so about 10% of the TIN 200 are Agritech companies. And beyond that, there are 109 early stage companies which we've identified which fit those criteria.
I'm very interested in the categorization you have of biotech, of high value manufacturing and kind of ICT. What does the breakup down look like of those three categories across the
across Agritech? Yeah, well, absolutely. The biggest part of that is high-tech manufacturing. And of course, in there you've got companies like Gallagher Group, which has been around for a long time and produces the electric fences and animal control and security and that sort of thing. That's one of the biggest ones in there. When it comes to biotech, we classify Livestock Improvement Corporation under that, so that's another big chunk of that. Some of the Agritech companies are there in the top 10 of the TIN 200, so they're really some of the biggest, most influential ones there. And then you've got smaller niche, which is ICT, and that's actually a very small part of that overall revenue from TIN companies, and that's only roughly about 2%, which is an interesting thing that came out of this, because I think as we'll probably come to sort of later in the discussion, that really is giving a bit of a signal for where the industry has come over the last 100 years or so. There's some very old companies here, and where it potentially could go from here.
No, that's really interesting. In terms of where the companies are, my gut feeling is that a lot of Agritech is regional. So whereas when we look at certain other tech verticals such as fintech, we might say they're focused very much in the major cities. What was the kind of results of your survey in terms of identifying where Agritech takes place in New Zealand?
Yep. Well, actually, Auckland is top of the list. A lot of them are headquartered in Auckland, even though a lot of them might operate further out. But of course, in the central North Island, around Waikato area, there's a big focus there. And then in the South Island, obviously around Canterbury, the other sections there. So that's the three main areas where all those 129 companies that we look at are focused. So, I think obviously most of those headquartered in Auckland. That's the very much a nerve centre for the wider economy in New Zealand. So understandable that a lot of them are headquartered there, even though they might not have all their field operations or testings necessarily elsewhere.
Turning to you, Greg, when you made your opening remarks, I think you said that North America was the largest export market
for Agritech.
For Agritech.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering how that relates to other parts of the tech, because of course, as I said, this is one very specific report you've written for the Agritech sector, but you've had a lot more of experience of looking at the wider country's tech sector. Is that a similar finding?
Slightly more in favour of the United States than generally. So Australia's a reasonably small proportion of the Agritech sector, quite a significant part of the wider 200 technology exporters. So roughly it's about 25% between the United States, New Zealand and Australia. But if you go to markets like the health tech sector, the vast majority of their revenue, something like 80+%, is in the Northern Hemisphere in Europe and the United States.
Interesting. Were you able to detect any trends in terms of the kind of areas where New Zealand Agritech companies are performing particularly well? Were there any trends or developments over the last kind of 5 years that are kind of underpinning the way that the sector's growing?
Maybe I'll give a response and pass over to you.
Oh, you want me to respond? Yeah.
So I'll give a broader response, and then I think that what we're seeing is early signs of the Agritech sector, which is quite well established. Companies like NDA, Gallagher's, LIC, etc. There are early signs of a change in business models, more move towards digitization and more investment coming particularly from the United States and other countries. There certainly have been a lot of acquisitions in the past 3 or 4 years, primarily from European companies. Brendan, does that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think always a fascinating thing every year of doing the TIN report is the new companies that are out there. They might operate under the radar for a long time, but then they come on to our awareness in various ways. And the really cool thing about this Agritech report is the number of startups that are out there and the ones developing new IP, which we just hadn't been surveying before, hadn't been on our list. So there's a TIN 200 obviously, but there's over 1,000 companies which we survey every year. And anyway, so in these early stage ones, which we track in the report, compared to that number I said before, about 2% of the TIN 200 being in ICT, almost half, 47% of the ones in the early stage companies that are coming through are operating now in that ICT space. There's been a real shift there of thinking, probably like a lot of the big high-tech manufacturers have kind of got the market cornered there, but those new innovative ideas of what the early stage companies can do digitally, that really seems to be where the innovation's happening, and there's a lot of exciting ones which we saw operating in that space.
Yeah, I suspect that reflects also just the increase in digitisation on farms, period.
Absolutely.
There's a lot more of a move towards that kind of digital farm. And of course, running side by side with your report, the government recently announced the Agritech Industry Transformation Plan, the ITP, which is very much designed to encourage this type of development, both to support farmers and growers in New Zealand, but also to grow our exports. So I'm pretty sure and hopeful that initiative will help increase the export sales from New Zealand. It would be impossible to talk through this type of session without mentioning COVID-19, the impact of closed borders, And again, I'm just interested, Greg, in terms of your experience talking to a lot of players in the wider tech sector in terms of its impact and likely effects over the coming months and maybe even 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I'm quite weirdly excited by COVID-19. Not obviously because of the chaos and economic damage it's caused, but the opportunity it presents for New Zealand, which is a small, nimble, agile country with a cohesive, diverse society and trust in their leadership to respond more quickly. And I think that kind of DNA spread is not just in our society, but in our businesses. So the amazing thing through to the end of the March 31st year, and even past it, there's so many Kiwi tech companies doing incredibly well and having record years, maybe after a blip of uncertainty during the COVID-19 process. And this is why I find the tech sector so exciting. So it's not so much about the intricacies of the technology or the software, the printed circuit boards, but what we've got is technology, new business models that are technology enabled, that are providing far more resilience than historical business models. So increasingly, the MO for our technology businesses are companies providing from revenue as a service for cloud-based services, and they're providing essential infrastructure so on a B2B basis, so less affected by drops in consumer spending. And so they're able to sustain cash flows over this period. So yeah, I think you'll see a shift, a big step up in the washout from COVID-19 in terms of New Zealand's relative position competitively.
No, that's interesting. Obviously here we're at Fieldays TV, and it's fascinating when we look at some of the economic consequences of COVID-19, particularly here in New Zealand, where farming once again has kind of proved to be the stalwart in terms of being the backbone of our economy. And I've always personally found it quite interesting that some people have kind of talked about, do we go for a primary sector or do we go for our tech sector?
Yeah.
And I guess Agritech is a perfect example of that, the combination of the two. And I think that reflects the way that farming and growing is going, much more tech focused. And I'm just again wondering whether that was something that came through your survey when you...
Yeah, well, I mean, even, and we make this comment in the report, just if you look at New Zealand's innovation heritage and agriculture has just been intertwined for a very long time. So I think that it's really tied together there. And when it comes to responding to the COVID-19 challenge, I think a lot of the companies that we've talked to, it's very much where their minds are now. They're not seemingly concerned. Obviously, I wouldn't say they're daunted by it. There's a lot of energy that we see in there for how can we do it differently, and I think that reflects a bigger, the wider approach of the New Zealand tech sector as well. I can call out one as well as all the data that's in the report. There's quite a few great little case studies and interviews that we've had with some key companies around the country, and one I just would want to call out there is Blue Lab, which is they're on the 10-200. They've been moving up there steadily over a number of years. Interestingly, they are a 30-year-old company and started off being called New Zealand Hydroponics, and then when their CEO came on in 2004, saw that the technology opportunity that was there was going to be an area which would have more of a future, and so they pivoted way back then and turned into focusing more on the devices that they do for measuring pH in soil and a whole lot of those sort of things. And so now, beyond sort of a 10-year transformation that they've gone to, now they're still moving up the 10-300. They're succeeding. They're exporting into the US successfully, and they're looking now to how they can still do things differently about, do they sell via virtual events and virtual marketing and all that. So there's a real mindset there for innovation and working with the changing times.
Interested you mentioned Blue Lab. Right. They're from Tauranga, which is where I'm personally based, and I know Greg and Jono there extremely well. And actually, it segues into a really interesting opportunity around collaboration. So again, just in terms of context, Blue Lab is part of a consortia of companies that are working together called Plantech, and it's looking at the automation of horticulture. And so organisations such as Zespri, Plant and Food Research, Robotics Plus, Trimax, Cucumber, quite a few of the companies I'm sure you will have looked at during this whole process. And what they're doing is they're collaborating together to try and identify new technology and innovation that can help automate aspects of horticultural production. And I'm just wondering again whether that kind of concept of clustering is something that you've experienced again, Greg, not just necessarily in agritech, but in other sectors, and the impact that can potentially have for New Zealand.
Yeah, I think if there was a single message from our discussion here today, I don't think New Zealanders have done collaboration well in the past, particularly because we're a small country and a small economy. But where we're talking about a global opportunity, it totally makes sense. And I think the amount of collaboration required to address COVID-19 in the first place has changed people's mindsets from my experience since. So I think if we take a whole of New Zealand approach and look at complementarities between business, so if you get three businesses who are providing solutions in an ecosystem, potentially by collaborating, they can triple their customer base by dealing with two other companies. And so, yeah, it's starting to make a lot of sense. So I think through things like Agritech NZ and Fieldays, there should be more conversations about what we can do as a country that's out of the box, because the issues of scale in New Zealand are to our advantage to try stuff without the kind of risks of a larger, more complex society.
Yeah, interesting. And again, you mentioned Agritech New Zealand. Obviously, I'm executive director, so I know the organisation extremely well.
And you've done a fantastic job.
Well, thank you very much, Greg. I'll buy the beer after. Basically, we've managed to pull together a number of different stakeholder groups, so industry, research, government, investors, and a whole series of what I call support agencies, whether it's banks or consultancies. So there is that collaborative nature or the collaborative network that's been built around Agritech. But I'm interested in your view of the role of government in terms of where it can play a role to support that type of collaboration. So
yeah, I think I say this about collaboration because I have been a collaboration cynic, but what you see is an environment where people collaborate and everybody wins out of the equation rather than someone having to give something away. I think there's a real opportunity for government to engage with industries to firstly remove any regulatory or other barriers that might inhibit that collaboration, and particularly the opportunity around things where the customer might be a government agency to support that. So I think if we, again, have our team of 5 million a concept, we need government working closely with business, both in organisations like MB or NZTE, MFAT, etc., both internally, the Ministry of Agriculture, internally and externally, because I really think we can slingshot this whole thing to be a massive window of opportunity for all our technology sectors, precisely because of collaboration and that cohesion that we have in this country.
Well, it's interesting that maybe Agritech can help lead the way. I mentioned before the fact that we've got the Agritech Industry Transformation Plan. That's actually being launched next Tuesday by Minister Twyford. And what's been fascinating to see about that is how 5 or 6 government agencies have worked together.
Yes.
So rather than having that kind of traditional silo, we found NZTE, Callaghan Innovation, MB, MPI, MFAT working around this goal of seeing how they can collectively support collaboration with the sector.
And I think, sorry, Brendan, but I think the collaboration model that you have pioneered and others can be used across industries. We're trying to do a similar thing in the health tech sector, which there are some structural issues. But where the local ecosystem benefits and creates efficiencies and the companies benefit as well, why wouldn't you want that?
No, absolutely. Brendan, turning back to the report, were there any elements of the findings that were a surprise to you in terms of things that you weren't necessarily expecting?
I definitely think that actually seeing it depicted on the page when we've got that graph there about that the disparity, I suppose, between that small number of ICT companies that we have now, as opposed to, wow, the numbers that are coming through, that was really quite stark. And I think we've got some reflections in there on sort of where to from here. And what you mentioned there about industry transformation, that's one of the clear things that jumped out was it is an industry that's ripe for transformation. And I suppose that's where the report is our report is really trying to be an encourager to that approach, that need to think differently, think wider about how things can be done. So yeah, that was a really striking part.
I think there's another opportunity for the agritech sector to look at the business models that have been employed by faster growing sectors and seeing what can be learned from those.
Any examples of?
So yeah, if you look at software as a service or the health tech sector, providing additional revenue streams through digitization, instead of selling widgets, locking in the business as a service model, and then applying value add over that. So you get both the cash flow from the business, and you get the margins to support further investment. So you want essentially two things: strong cash flows and a mechanism to enable you to scale quickly. So there's marginal cost of new customer acquisition. And those are terms that investors love.
No, absolutely. And I absolutely agree with you that business models are something that are absolutely critical for Agritech looking forward. The idea of just walking up the kind of farmer's path and expecting the farmer to write out a check once every kind of 3 years before the widget kind of dies is probably a very old type of business model. So I suspect, and I'm certainly aware of a number of companies in New Zealand who are beginning to deploy some of those types of business models. Again, going back to a question that's raised earlier on around the 2%, the fact that half of startups are engaged in kind of 2% of activity. That seems a very significant number of early stage companies focusing on that kind of digital area.
Sure, yeah.
Again, is this something that you're experiencing in other tech sectors, or is this something that's particularly peculiar to Agritech because of its traditional historical focus on big widgets and machines and?
Yeah, the Agritech report is based on numbers from the TIN survey, which puts together the TIN report. So the big full report, which came out in November last year, also identified just how much ICT is driving the sector overall. That's where we saw a lot of the rising stars, a lot of the real star performers over the years are coming from that sector. So I think it's almost like Agritech is a little bit lagged behind that just because of that real legacy of the big high-tech manufacturers. And yeah, again, it just points to the opportunity that's there for transformation and opportunity for disruption as well, which is, I know, something that's on Greg's mind a lot. Disrupting how the sector is being disrupted.
Irish heritage.
There we go. Going back to a point you made just a few moments ago, Greg, you mentioned the word investment.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, again, going back to that whole thing of closed borders and COVID-19, are we seeing any big impacts in terms of particularly inbound investment from overseas into the sector?
Anecdotally not. So there have been some amazing venture capital and private equity deals done recently. I guess the one that comes to mind, not so much in the agritech space, was a company called Soul Machines that got an investment of over $40 million. And domestically, we've seen, and internationally, we've seen that continue. So one of the key trends in the past 3 years is just the dramatic growth of foreign investment in the technology sector, and we've seen that in the agritech with Yamaha Motor Ventures and Robotics Plus and Promus Ventures in Halter. So because of New Zealand's profile, we're fortunate to be, the technology sector is fortunate to be attracting the top tier investors, particularly from the United States, but from around the world. So it's kind of exciting to see that engagement with some of these more exciting tech businesses.
Yeah, again, I'm pretty aware of, obviously, Robotics Plus, very aware of George Kellerman from Yamaha Ventures. I actually bumped into George recently, obviously before borders were closed, and he told me that he'd flown from San Francisco to New Zealand 10 times in 12 months.
Wow.
So he was almost like the monthly return as an investor looking at opportunities here, and it's great to know that organisations like Finisterre Ventures have recently opened up a fund in Palmerston North.
That's right.
Which again there is excitement about what's taking place here within the agritech sector, not just domestically but by those big international players.
Yeah, and I think the momentum to invest in health tech after COVID-19 is obvious, right? You've got some very a lot of inertia in what's quite a conservative sector for all the right reasons. But similarly in agritech, the world's environment is being severely strained. We're running out of productive land to grow stuff. So the reduction in environmental damage and the greater productivity from the land that's already being farmed, are key issues that technology will help provide. And I think there's all sorts of exciting stuff in terms of disintermediation, linking growers directly with end customers in a seamless way that will put money back in the hands of the growers themselves, the productive sector, and link them more closely with their end customers. So all of those kind of things are really exciting if you're dealing in an agricultural sector that wants to add value and be the best in the certain categories it's chosen.
Yeah, interesting. Earlier on today, Greg, I attended a New Zealand Agritech Story workshop, and some of the points there you made absolutely were re-emphasised this morning. Despite closed borders, the reality is that climate change is still with us. We still have a growing global population that requires more food and fibre. And the question was New Zealand's role in actually producing food for that growing population. And I think the kind of overview there was the fact that we can potentially produce a little bit more food with the land we've got, but where we can really help the rest of the world is through our technology to help them feed themselves. So that was a very strong message that came through from that workshop this morning.
Yeah, I think one of the secrets, or not so transparent secrets of the technology sector, is the ability to add value and reduce cost, both at the same time. And so that translates to essentially greater viability for growers and farmers to grow their business and make more money out of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely right. Just kind of coming towards the end of the interview now. So in terms of the findings that you've got, if you've got that kind of crystal ball and could look ahead 3 to 5 years, where do you see the sector heading? What's your view in terms of?
Clearly, COVID is going to be an ongoing issue for the world. I think we've been very lucky in this country that we've been able to take control of that situation as much as is possible here, but it's going to have ongoing impacts around the world. And I suppose that's where the TIN report over time can provide a deeper insight into what's going on, because the numbers that are in this report are from last year's survey. So we were launching that just in November, before COVID was even really something that has been thought of. And so coming to the end of that financial year period is when we're doing the survey now. So if there's a reminder too to those companies out there that haven't submitted their surveys yet to get those back to us for this year, because that'll start to give us a good picture for what's happened in the last 12 months. And then next year we'll be able to do the survey again and sort of see what the long-term impacts are last year. So people go to tin100.com, they can find where they can request a survey. And if we just keep our eye on the industry in all these different ways, we can start to learn things over time. Particularly, TIN has now been doing this for 16 years. This is the 16th year that we've done the survey, and so there's a lot of knowledge that's in there going back a long time, so we can start to look at trends. But yeah, COVID's going to be the thing for the next few years, I think.
So I think that's probably a suitable area to almost finish. You mentioned tin100.com.
Yep.
We've obviously been talking about the tin report now in terms of the high-level kind of content,
Yep.
But it will be available, I think, in about 5 minutes for people to download.
Conclusion of this interview, you can go to tin100.com and find the report there and download it and start reading all the goodness in there for yourself.
That's great. Well, look, Greg and Brendan, it's been fabulous to have you in the studio this afternoon, and it's great that Tin have produced this report, and I, for one, will certainly be downloading it as soon as I get back to my office.
Great.
So thank you very much.
Thank you
very much.